Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. Welcome back to you as well, Ben. How are you?
G'day, mate. How are we?
I'm very well. Hey, we did some interesting maths just before we hit record, didn't we?
We did. Well, it's on the back of, obviously, the challenges that are going around. So I think we should, keep the listeners in suspense in terms of the number of times that we've rented properties and the number of times.
Stick around for Did You Know?
Well, I can do that for Did You Know. We'll do that. We'll do that.
All right.
Obviously, we do have an important message here, and that is a message that is coming out of New South Wales, which is similar to what we saw in Queensland.
Yep.
Even though the proposed changes out of Queensland were very much erroneous to the landlord, we're also starting to see some challenges in New South Wales in regards to getting that balance right and understanding that everyone does matter. So we were contacted by Leanne Pilkington, the president of the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, and we've read through the documentation here, and we do support it in terms of what we think is the right process. So by a quick summary, Bryce, if I'm a tenant and I've got $50,000 in my bank account, I can still get a rent reduction. Now, I don't know whether that's fair. I'm not sort of thinking, wait a minute, ultimately you get the shelter, you've engaged in a contract. It's a bit like me going, hey, Bryce, your phone over there, you got that on a payment contract with a, let me just steal that phone off you. So we're sitting in two different offices, we're social distancing. Let me just grab that phone, Bryce. Now I'm going to use it, but you just keep paying for it, because that's what it's like from a landlord's point of view. It's like, it doesn't seem fair that I could just take your phone and then not walk away. And I also don't think it sounds fair that if I'm a tenant and I feel like, well, I shouldn't have to leave a property with a debt or whatever. I'm not sure that's right. So it's going to be in the show notes. We're also going to push it out to our database of all of the people who have downloaded things in our community, because we just think it's important that we write to the Premier and have the same sort of understanding around the challenges that some landlords are going through in these difficult times as well. Now, hopefully we're seeing rays of sunshine on the horizon. We know that as of tomorrow, we'll get a bit of a guide in regards to the relaxation of the restrictions that we've seen. So that's very exciting. But Parliament is going to be called next Tuesday. And so we're calling on the government to look at the way in which they've structured their regulation to be more balanced, because all it's going to do is clog up the dispute resolution, because everyone's going to dig their heels in, and we just don't think that's fair. So we're looking for fair, because, as you know, we have been tenants in the past, Bryce. We're going to share with you how many times we've been tenants in my Did You Know.
Yeah.
I've got 2 Did You Knows. That means I've got 2 Did You Knows this week. But what have you got for me?
Well, Did you know, mate? If you've got 2, maybe we should save one for next week, just so that just in case we turn up in the studio and you.
Well, the other one's relevant on an economic point of view, because again, I think there's miscommunication out there in terms of unemployment rates. So it's an exclusive. It's my read on the market anyway. Oh. What other housekeeping news have we got?
Well, a couple of things. You did your regular RBA feed, which was on the podcast too, which was really good.
Bit of a rant this week, wasn't it?
A bit tough for Stiggy to try and do a few editing tricks on that one, mate. But the good thing about it was there was quality. So, folks, if you haven't had a chance to go and check that out, Ben's RBA chat was very, very good. A couple of other things too, Ben. You and I are trying to help people in ISO. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to do our first book, The Armchair Guide to Property Investing. We're actually going to do one Facebook Live a week, where we're actually going to give the stories and the anecdotes and add some meat to the bones around the main points in each chapter. So last week we did chapter 1, Ben, in the bank. We'll upload it to the podcast at some stage in the future. But at this point, if you want to go to our Facebook page, we are going to read chapter 2 today, later on today, Ben. So by the time this comes out at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Ben, there should be a Facebook Live that they could go and check out too, with us reading.
There is one thing that we've never talked about on the podcast, Bryce, and that is the 18 strategies.
Yeah.
So that will be interesting, right? In terms of the first time you're ever going to hear it is us actually talking about those strategies. So
Facebook
there
Live.
is a little bit of carrot in there that one day we're going to be talking about those strategies. So I'm looking forward to.
So come and check it out, folks. It's normally about 10, 15. Oh, I said 10, 15. It was 19 last week, but that's standard. Stock standard for us.
We can't do 10.
But folks, it's not an audio book. It's not an audio book where we're going to read word by word by word, because you've seen how Ben reads. But we are going to pick up the main point of the chapter, and then we're going to chat about it. So we're excited about that. So come and check it out. And if you need a copy of that book so that you can play along at home, you can go to the armchairguide.com.au and you can get a free copy. Hey, Ben, my Mindset Minute theme today.
Very good.
I've pulled out, I enjoy James Clear's information. We've had him on the podcast. He did a really good one during the week that I wanted to quote. In a world where information is abundant and easy to access, the real advantage is knowing where to focus. James Clear. And I think the reason that resonated for me is because that's been our goal for our community throughout the history of this podcast, was to try and provide frameworks that make it easy for people to go and then curate the information, Ben. They can go, of all the information that is out there, how do I decipher that into some meaningful content? But I think that is the challenge. I was thinking about this is the challenge for our kids, Ben, because they're going into a school system that caters for memorization, which was appropriate back in the 70s and the early 80s when we started off in primary school, Ben. But you actually don't have to memorize anything anymore, Ben. You don't have to, most kids are walking around with an advanced calculator in their hand. All they need to do is talk to Siri and say, where is the 4 presidents on the side of a mountain? It all just happens, Ben. So the system that is that catered for you and me. I mean, you and I got university degrees, BG, before Google, but our kids won't have to do that, right? So that is the challenge. Our kids will have access to information at their fingertips for free. So the skill is actually not in the remembering of the information. It's actually how you curate it to know where you focus. So I thought that was important, because I think the 2 biggest skills going forward, and then the 2 biggest skills that I'll be teaching my boys, is 1, how to problem solve, Ben, and 2 is how to take action. Because if you know how to problem solve and you know how to take action, I've seen people who are intellectually inferior and self-confessed intellectually inferior that have far better results than people who are intellectually superior, Ben.
You're talking about me.
Wow, mate. Mate, you open a can of worms there, mate. I could go to play the dark play. No, but if you know how to problem solve, Ben, and you know how to take action, you will walk the road less travelled.
Correct.
There will not be a traffic jam on that path, Ben, because that's for much. So James Clear said, in a world where information is abundant and easy to access, the real advantage is knowing where to focus. So there you go, folks. Take that. Today we've got a very special guest, Ben.
We do.
We've had our guest on before, but given the environment, we thought it might be a good idea to have our guest Scott back on to the podcast, because we've been talking about how to navigate the coronavirus, or as some people have been saying, Ben, you've had the GFC, and now we've got the GVC, which is the global viral.
I think that's gonna carry forward. The GVC is definitely going to have some legs.
Yeah, I think it will. So, and a number of commentators are using that. So you're right, it'll probably be picked up at the GVC. So we wanted to know, given his subject matter expertise is largely now in the commercial property space, we thought it would be interesting to see how to navigate the GVC in commercial property. So let's cut to the interview we recently had with Scott O'Neill. All right, Ben, we've got a very special guest today. Returning back to the property couch, we have Scott O'Neill, who is the founder and director of Rethink Investing. Ben, Scott was on the property couch with us way back in episode 230. It's good to have him back on. Welcome back to the couch. Scott, how are you?
Very good. Thanks, guys, for having me back.
It's a pleasure. Hey, mate.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about, haven't we? It's an interesting time. So it's really interesting to sort of see where the commercial space is going. But back to you, Bryce.
Well, I was going to say, Ben, episode 230 really delves into Scott's backstory, how the journey from residential right through to commercial, and clearly now operates as a buyer's agent in the commercial space. So for anyone who really wants to delve into that backstory, I'd certainly recommend that you look back to that episode. But today we really wanted to get you on, Scott, because clearly in a COVID environment, we really want to delve into some of the questions and some of the key topics around commercial. But before we do, I know that you're based in Sydney and you live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Can you give us a little bit of an insight on what's happening in your neighbourhood in terms of demand for listings, prices, and even the rental story?
Yeah, it's really interesting times, and I think what I'm seeing on the ground doesn't quite match up to the media stories. There's a lot of those, the standard 40% crash stories that we've seen for the last 2 decades almost are out there. And look, there are going to be some parts of the market I think will fall in value. Like there's, the high-rise market in Sydney, like where they rely on a lot of overseas investors. Maybe there's more supply coming on the market. I think you guys actually refer it to as a junk stock, some of that stuff. Your one-bedders that have got very high strata levies, and there's just always a lot of supply of it coming up. They're going to have less demand, and funding it is going to be harder with the banks. So naturally, you'd think a lot of the falls will be concentrated into those types of markets. But the good quality suburbs, like in the eastern suburbs, I really can't see price falls in the majority of areas. You're going to see rental values fall. Like where I live quite close to Bondi, and there's a lot of for lease signs around at the moment because there's, as you could imagine, there's a lot of backpackers and tourists that, use the short-term rentals and long-term rentals here. And there is a void in the market at the moment. And I think the latest stats out are the rents in the eastern suburbs around sort of Bondi have dropped 10%. Some parts of the CBD are down as much as 17%. So, they're pretty big numbers from a rental point of view, but I haven't seen prices actually fall because there's just no supply. There's a tight market. There's generally more buyers than sellers anyway. And, if there's less properties to choose from, there's always a buyer for those places. And people can still get funding if they're in good positions. And I think a lot of this, this COVID environment has hurt certain parts of the market more than others. Like, for example, I think like I read the other night that the hardest hit sectors have been hospitality and the arts and recreation sectors, which account for 60% of the total job losses. So they're generally not the types of people that be buying, freestanding houses in, a lot of the markets that we buy in. And so, look, it will hurt the rental side of things more, but, the people that will hold will try to, because they've got low interest rates. The banks are offering, these, 6 months of, I guess, relief on the rent, on their mortgages as well. So, look, we're sort of seeing prices stable, to be honest, across, and some of the more cheap markets are, still got the same kind of ratios that were there before COVID. There's just less transactions going on. So that's sort of what we're seeing on the ground.
Scott, you said before we push record around there's Bondi is tightly held, and the anecdote around people are hoping that can you expand on that a little bit for the benefit of the listeners?
Yeah, look, we're all in the industry where we like to have sensible conversations about property, and there's almost a secondary crowd that they beg for price crashes. These markets are going to drop by 50%. I heard someone said 70% the other day. And you normally just switch off when you hear that type of stuff. But there's a team of people out there that have always hoped that prices will crash. And I guess, the reality is people won't just sell their house for 50% less. Banks will not allow houses to fall that much. The Australian economy is based on property as well. There is so many levers the government will pull to keep, I think property ticking along as they need to. And they're talking about like infrastructure booms after this, just to lower that unemployment. They're talking about, I've seen some stories around abolishing stamp duty. I don't know what that would look like or what they would replace it with, but there's levers that will stop that worst case Armageddon story from happening. And it's almost a little bit humorous to see it year after year, and they never get tired of those stories. But that's why we're in this industry. We believe it's a good long-term investment, and you just got to buy a property for the right fundamentals and nothing else. You don't buy into the latest clickbait article because it never really eventuates year after year.
Yeah, you were talking before about how there's a group of people who want Bondi to fall just so that they can get into the market, but it's so tightly held that that's not going to happen. Hey, look, just before we go, and I thought it's worth, for those people that haven't listened to the previous podcast we did with you, it's worth pointing out that that you're an experienced and active investor because you were able to retire from your day job at the age of 28. And at the time we chatted with you, you had close to 30 properties with in excess of $17 million worth of value. So arguably one of the more successful young property investors, although not so young anymore, Scott. Do you still sort of hang your hat on the young property investor, or you sort of
33? Got a 6-month-old, so it's probably over the hill now for me. I don't know. Where's that boundary?
Well, yeah. Maybe
you're over the hill. We're close to the grave. That's for sure.
Hey, speak for yourself, mate. You're 4 years older than me, but so in terms of your core subject matter expertise, you're one of those folks who's personally been involved in both residential and commercial. But the conversation today, we really want to focus around the commercial side of things. What clearly it's been the great work from home experiment globally, and lots of companies are now starting to see that their workforce is actually okay working from home. In some cases, productivity is fine or even improved. And for a lot of folks, putting their hands up saying, "Hey, look, there's actually some real lifestyle benefits here." What do you see being the trends around commercial property, and in particular that corporate commercial property space where people are starting to pressure test? What does the new norm look like?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, which we won't know the final answer for, I think, another 12 months as businesses settle to this new environment. So I guess there's 3 sectors of the commercial market that we'll discuss. So there's office, industrial, and retail. And they're all doing different things at the moment. So to start with your question, office space is one where I think there's, I guess, the greatest cloudy area at the moment, because there's a lot of businesses, like you said, that are embracing this flexible work arrangement style. Like there's, extremely high costs for renting a good quality office in the CBD of a Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane type location. And I guess there's a lot of businesses that may contemplate, maybe downsizing their office space. Maybe they'll do 2-day work from home days for people. But it really just will go back to the type of business. So if you've got like a call center, for instance, where you're very KPI based, and these types of businesses may need offices more so than a business like ourselves, like buyers agency. So we're more on the road. Where we naturally have a more flexible office role. But there's, I know personally, I'm looking forward to getting back into the office. We're working from home at the moment. I know my staff are in that same boat because it is harder to work from home as well. Like, with kids or roommates, or maybe someone's house is big enough to set up for a small office. Maybe they've got pets. Like, there's all these things that come into it, and there are a lot of people that value a good office, but there's some locations such as Sydney where the travel time to get to your office is so great these days that, that might force certain types of businesses and areas to, I guess, have those types of flexible work arrangements. So on the ground, we haven't seen much change yet because COVID's only really been around affecting the market since March. And it's really just been April with a full lockdown. And, most businesses are kind of just idling away, working from home. Turnover's still happening. So we're yet to see the long-term impacts with that. The types of investments I would still buy, and we have been buying in the last month for clients, like your boutique type offices. Like I really, like sort of accountancy type businesses, lawyer firms, like even things like mortgage broking businesses where they're not just in a giant office tower, because there's, it's the supply type conversation. When there's a lot of supply of office, like big towers, there's I guess you're more prone to falling down with the market when demand reduces. But if you're in small boutique offices or little freestanding type, 2 or 3 floor offices in, a suburb type arrangement, I think there'll still be demand for those. They're also cheaper in general as well than the A class stuff in the city. So look, I don't know that answer. I don't think anyone does just yet with offices, but you would tend to think overall there would be less demand on office space long term. But then it depends on how good business in general is operating, because when the economy picks up, there's going to be more businesses, which leads to demand on floor space for offices.
Scott, you make a good point. I've been doing some reading on this sort of stuff at the moment in around the behaviours and what changes when we see a significant event like we're seeing now with the pandemic. And history tells us that we are social creatures. In fact, our cultures are created by engagement with others and how we do that in our celebrations and our festivals and so forth. The events that probably are as dramatic as a lockdown that we saw is the September 11 attack we saw in New York, where it had a significant impact on the psychology of people, and we got commentary around changes in behaviour around what they call nesting and those types of things, and so that meant that everyone was going home and being closer to family, and they were absolutely nesting. So it was a thing, but within 18 months to 24 months, our innate sense to be as social creatures, to be engaging with others and to be mixing with others and to have those environments eventually shone through. And so cities like New York, where it just felt different for that period of time, came back, over a course of 5 or so years to be that thriving metropolis that everyone loves and why it's a mecca that attracts so many people to it because of its hub and its activity. And I think Sydney and Melbourne has a bit of that with its sporting scenes and its cultural scenes as well. So I make reference to your commentary around offices. I think process work in terms of white collar processing work that can be done at home or that can be done anywhere, that's probably the bit that is at risk. The creative work and the varied type work aspect. So there's in larger businesses, in small business, there is some slow thinking that needs to be done and some creative thinking that needs to be done that needs strong collaboration. And I'm not sure you're going to be able to get that through working in a home environment. I think there's going to still have to be a base of some description for that creative work to take place, for that mind mapping to sort of be shared. So as much as I tend to think, the social commentators are sort of saying this is going to change how we work indefinitely and it's going to have a lasting effect on us. Look, I mean, we also need to look at what Yahoo did in terms of they attempted it for many, many years to have a work from home policy, but ultimately reverted back to, they're in the creative space, they're in a fast moving space, and they needed talent to be working and collaborating together to get the best results. And sometimes you can't do that if you've got 15 people in a video conference meeting and not everyone can only talk once at a time, and it's hard to see it, and then someone's internet's dropping out or being faulty, so we all have to stop and we have to re-go. So productivity points of view, I think there is going to be something in the medium term that sort of says to us that there is going to be a need for that type of office space. The question is given how much we've got of it and this period of supply versus demand, I think if you're looking commercially to negotiate a lease or to buy something in some of those larger spaces, I think you're going to be in a strong negotiating position in terms of that. So I definitely think that there is an element of impact, and if you're an owner and investor in that, what's your thoughts around, because the biggest one for me always about commercial has been the consistency of income and the longevity of income. If you have a building vacant or a floor of your building vacant for a period of time, that has a big cash flow impact. So what are you saying to your commercial buyers around what could be the impact around cash flow to be able to maintain and hold that asset during a time where they may not have that demand for the next 6 months or even 12 months in that space?
Yeah, good question. And look, I guess number one, before you ever buy a commercial property, you need to understand the reletting, scenarios in front of you and plan for worst case scenarios. So if you can't understand how long it would take to fill it, and you need to find examples or just maybe the property's got to be so unique that it's hard to even find those comparables. But I guess where you see the long full lease signs, it's in those areas where the business model doesn't work as well. So, your highway terrace style retail shop where there's no experience for the customer to walk up and down a highway, it doesn't justify the rent anymore. So when those go vacant, they stay vacant for a long time. But we always look at the relatability of it, and you need to interview many real estate agents that have recently leased properties out, and if you can find 3 to 6 months vacancies in between it, and you can be, I guess, confident over many examples that's the vacancy period. That's good to understand, and you've got to remember a lot of commercial leases have a minimum 6 months notice period to leave a property. So a good situation, you hopefully have a 12-month head start to lease a property anyway, because the tenant's not just going to say, I need to leave next week. They're going to say, look, we're thinking of leaving because this property is too big or too small for us. Would you like to start advertising early? And it's then going to be a little bit more less stressful to find those types of properties. But, you just got to understand that risk. You need to hold buffers in place. There's generally a higher deposit amount you need for commercial. So they do minimum 20% deposits, but in most cases, it's a 30% deposit. So the bank's factoring in, I guess, that extra, need for the cash flow and from their risk point of view as well. But you look, most people that buy commercial property understand this. And look, a lot of the areas, the average tenure for a property we buy is a 9-year tenure. So the tenant will stay for multiple lease terms. And you can look into this when you do your market research. So there's extra layers of research you have to do to, I guess, come to these viewpoints. If you don't understand this stuff, like you don't just jump into it. You need to sort of do your homework. And once you do get your head around like the average time to find a tenant, what types of tenants would release this property, like how many different style tenants, what kind of incentives do you have to offer, what type of length of lease is the standard for that area, how long, what are the actual increases going to look like in the lease per annum? Like, are they going to be CPI, 3%, 4%? Like these things you need to understand. But when you do, you can research your way out of a lot of the perceived risk people have, and it can be a very profitable exercise. But
it's the classic due diligence story, isn't it? In terms of, and due diligence is not just first layer, it's second layer, third layer, fourth layer, which is what you're articulating. You did mention about these highway style roads that are no-go zones. So for the listeners' benefit, can you give us a couple of examples of roads around the countries that you would say would be difficult and not something that you would be looking at in terms of what you would think is a grade commercial location?
Yeah, so in Sydney, Parramatta Road's an example.
I was thinking that.
It's a very, very busy road, very old style terraces. Like they've got the classic used car, shops around there. They've got the Ugg boot stores. They've got the, there's all sorts of, just tired style businesses. And look, I'm sure there's some very good ones along there, but there's no foot traffic. So that's the issue. So why would you have a retail shop where you're paying $10,000 a month or $5,000 a month, even if it is? That's a lot of money to pay for no customers walking past, or very little. So retail, you really want that constant foot traffic. Otherwise, you may as well be online. And I guess this is one of the other changes that might come out of COVID, is a lot of retail businesses might rethink if they need to, spend $150,000 a year on rent. Is it better to spend $150,000 on Facebook marketing or Google ads to generate the same amount of customers? Like, we'll see. I've heard, I think Platypus is a recent one that they're trying to go with more, that they're the shoe sales that are based in Westfields. I'm not sure if they're going to remain in there, but they're pushing for their online market share a lot more. So that's just interesting to see how businesses are adapting to generate revenue as much as they can. And like another one in Sydney is also along. There's what's the road called? The one that sort of leads into Darlinghurst. Name of
it's like the Eastern Distributor, but just off the Eastern Distributor there. Is that what you're talking, coming into Surrey Hills?
Yeah, coming into Surrey Hills. So like the rents there are just higher again. So it's a better
Oxford
area.
Street and those type of
Oxford Street. That's what
they get a bit of foot traffic there, but you're right in terms of it. Anything that has a 2 or a 3 lane road, very difficult to pull over to the side and do a shop. So, I mean, I think for our listeners' benefit, this is the type of education we want to share. So get online if you're not familiar with Sydney and Google Parramatta Road and do a flyover of Parramatta Road and look up and down Parramatta. This is how you get educated. So, you know, we get people like Scott onto the show to give us some of those frameworks to look at in terms of how you would start to do your due diligence. You've already, you know, you should be note taking around, okay, I need to have more buffer. These are the sort of LVRs that I need. You know, these are the sort of things I need. Long-term, you know, tenant assurity. I need to investigate the, you know, the viability of the tenant that's in those properties. That's the type of story that we're trying to get out. So they're really two good examples, Scott. So I appreciate that. In terms of, it's probably not a bad little segue over to you. You were talking about office, industrial, and also retail. So what other views do you have? Oh, Mike, Bryce.
So I was just going to say, before we go to the office, Scott, I see a trend around. I think what's happened with the work from home experiment is that people have realised that they're happier when they don't have to be constantly commuting, and then they, I think, some fringe location, the CBD commutable fringe locations will become more popular with owner occupiers. So if you think about, I live in Torquay in the Surf Coast. You've got the northern tip of the Sunshine Coast, the southern tip of the Gold Coast, Wollongong, Central Coast. These are areas where people think, oh, lifestyle's pretty good, but still that commute's a bit of a burn, right? Whereas if they can actually spend a bit more time where their employer has said, well, yeah, this actually works. I think you can you can work from home. So that'll start to become more and more popular, and then people will all of a sudden they'll have to reconcile with what you said before around, okay, well, I'm working from home, but the environment, the state that I'm in, I'm not in the zone. So therefore, I think there'll be a rise of co-working spaces where the commercial space will be able to cater for businesses that are setting those up. Because I talk to a number of people that are setting up co-working spaces, and it's not just the co-working space, but they've got the yoga studio next door, and they've got the daycare downstairs, and they've got the food and the juice bar nearby. So it's this community hub, which I think provides the hybrid between everyone being purely in the office space versus purely home-based, but allows the best of both worlds. So do you agree, disagree? Are you seeing any trends or any observations around that?
Yeah, no, I agree totally. And I think, let me be really clear about one thing with commercial property. Like, office space is not all equal. Retail is not all equal. Industrial is not all equal. So you've brought up a really good point. I've never really been a fan of the high-rise office space where it's like there's 20 floors of it and it's all identical. There's no balconies. It's just a square meter rate and that's it. But when you go into a more of a boutique setup, you know, where you've got your local accountant, there might be a chiropractor in there, or, you know, those types of small, like allied medical type properties. I absolutely love them because we've bought hundreds of them with these properties with our clients over the years, and we're not hearing any bad stories out of COVID. Even businesses that have been forced to shut down, like physios at the moment, they're good businesses and they've got buffers in place and they're actually surviving at the moment. Just on a little bit less revenue, of course, but most businesses are somewhat a little bit slower. But I think COVID-19 is actually just showing where the weaker businesses are, the ones that were kind of running month to month, and they're going to basically be the ones that come out of this with pain. And then there's the other businesses that have their buffers in place, just like a good investor. They've planned for, I guess, quite a months ahead. And you know, like accountancies and lawyers and you know, a good mortgage broker, or, you know, we've bought into, like, there's a lot of not-for-profit type businesses out there that have offices that are still going quite well. And, you know, they don't necessarily need to pay top dollar to be in a CBD, you know, Darling Harbour or, you know, AAA grade building where they're paying twice the square metre rate as somewhere 3 Ks out from the CBD what would be. So, yeah, it's all about just having a unique factor. Like any type of property, you just don't want to buy into an area where there's a lot of supply, because then you will suffer the you know, the general slowdown that some sectors will kind of force you down with. But the little businesses that have a good business in place, you know, closer to lifestyle locations, I think they could do quite well.
So can you give us a little bit of an insight of the headspace of some of your clients? You've talked about the fact, like that physio the physio, clearly they're not earning as much revenue, so therefore they may or may not have to be talking to the landlord about whether or not they can put off the rent or reduce the rent, whatever they arrange. But it's not for the faint-hearted, in terms of people who go into commercial, because in the previous conversation we had, we talked about that people. You may have a different view, but you're playing in a more sophisticated space, whereas the fact that residential is so imperfect is really where the opportunity exists, because people have an emotional need around needing shelter and a roof over their head, versus someone who knows the science and the art around investing in property can see the anomalies and look for the differences. Whereas when you're playing in commercial space, it's a totally different sophisticated market. There's no fallback position that it's a roof over your head. So it'd be good to get an understanding of some of the mindsets that some of your clients have been experiencing during the last 6 weeks, and what sort of messaging you've been helping them get their headspace right to make sure that they don't go to sleep with one eye open or have their bellies full of anxiety.
Yeah, look, I think in general the commercial investors are they're more experienced investors in general. Like, they generally have a foundation in residential portfolio, or if they don't, I've got a lot of clients that are just pure commercial, but they run a business and they've rented or bought properties before. So I guess that's why I like commercial, because I think it is in a way a little bit more predictable, because you don't have that that emotional up and down that you can. But from a tenancy point of view, I find the laws favour the owners more so. Like, we all know that residential, the land, like the tenants will always come off on the right side of the fence when it comes to a rent dispute, because the law favours or protects the tenants, rightly so in some occasions. But with commercial, it's really just a lawyer talking to an accountant, talking to a business person that probably wants to stay there, and with a reasonable owner. Now, I don't think there's some exceptions to that, but I'll give you an example. I've only had one of my personal properties ask for a rent reduction, and it's a small supermarket. And I thought he'd be the last person to ask for a rent reduction. And I thought, do I just be, do I be the bad guy and just say, go away because I know you're actually doing better business? And I thought about it, but I thought, look, he's only asked for a 25% discount. The law states now with legislation that they've got to pay 50% of that rent reduction over the next 12 months. So I've only done a 2-month agreement as well. So it's really just almost like a relationship to think, you know what, I'm not going to be greedy here. That's not going to make a difference to me. But you've asked, it was in that kind of early April period where there's a lot more opportunist rent discount seeking, which was evident in the residential markets as well, because there were some lobby groups telling tenants not to pay their rent, things like that. There was less of that in commercial, but there's, there was an example, like one of the major pharmacy companies were asking for rent reductions, even though their stock has gone up, even though their trade's up about 30%, they were asking for a rent reduction. So that's all kind of filtered out now that, you've got to show financials to your landlord with reduced revenue to justify the rent. And the rent's got to be, you've got to have financials less than 30% down as well. So you can apply for JobKeeper. So there's a bit of a process to ask for a rent discount, and a lot of I'd only say I probably heard of about maybe 10 of my clients, and we bought over 1,800 properties over the years, and there's probably a couple I haven't heard of, but 10 out of 1,800 tenants asking for rent reduction. It's a pretty good ratio so far. I'm not sure if more will come out of it, but it's really just the businesses that were forced lockdown. So that a few gym businesses were the ones that were hardest hit. Cafés, they're obviously down in trade, but the majority of businesses like we've bought a number of dentists. Dentist trade is obviously going to be down, but the lease is still the lease is still the lease in commercial. They have to pay their rent, and the only way they can get around that's through this new legislation where they've got to, I guess, sit down with accountants' financials to prove a rent. There's a process to get a rent reduction, and most tenants, do want to be in their location, their office or their like they own the fit out. There's a lot of cost in moving a business. So yes, you don't need to live there, to go back to your residential comment, but your whole brand is sometimes associated with that location, and all your clients know that this is where your office is based. Maybe your head office, maybe it's a showroom style property, again, on a highway where you get good marketing exposure because thousands of cars drive past your property every day. Like, this is very important, and a business person values this, and they're not going to just let their, all their, the pride of their brand just die and not pay their rent just to save a little bit of money. So you deal with reasonable people, and I think that is why I like commercial. It is a business conversation every time. There's very little emotion with it, and that tends to keep things a little bit more, I guess, flat and predictable. And we're there for the good cash flow, and the tenant wants to be there long term for his brand because it costs too much money. So it is a win-win scenario, which I don't think is going to change too much in the long term.
And so what is that formal advice that you're giving out, Scott, to people who are approaching you? It is go to your property manager. There obviously is some legislation that you were talking about there where if income has fallen by greater than 30%, that's the trigger to start the conversation. And it's usually a conversation that's occurring between the tenant and the landlord's property manager, who's then the middleman to obviously the landlord. And so they're having that conversation and then setting that up. And if it is successful, you were just saying that before, that whatever rent is adjusted, 50% of that is foregone, and the other 50% is to be repaid over a period of time. Is that the best way to summarise it? Correct,
yeah. So the rental manager will do this because this is their job. They're professionals at negotiating with the tenants. And it's got to be proven on paper, how much loss they've had. And you just basically do short-term agreements, like month to month even. Like, we don't know what business is going to look like in 12 months' time. It might be better than it is, than it was 2 months ago. Like, there might be a massive recovery out of this. This coronavirus might drag things out where we'd need to keep doing, all right, let's reduce your rent by 30% for the next month as well. But from a commercial investor's point of view, like, we're buying properties 7 and 8% net returns in capital cities. If your net return drops back to 5 or 6% for the next 2 months, it's not the end of the world. And that's why I personally had no real issues with dropping my rent with my supermarket tenant, because it's not going to really make a big difference, but he's on a 5-year lease. I value the long-term relationship and the long-term value of that lease a lot more than, we're talking, $1,000 here or there in terms of cash flow. So it's, you just got to, I guess, the legislation that the government brought forward about this a 30% reduction and having to prove the financials stopped the opportunist style of things because that was what I was worried about, because I was worried about good businesses just trying to have a crack at trying to get half their rent for a while. That was early April. We're now in early May. We're not seeing any of this at the moment. It's sort of like people are kind of gearing up for, I guess, the opening of the economy again. And we're all the offices, all the industrial properties, and a lot of the retail properties, they're desperate to get back in and make up for lost ground. So it's just a matter of just kind of helping your tenant get through the tricky part that we've been through, and hopefully the pain's less for all.
Yep. Hey, Scott, I've got a question for you. You kind of hinted on it just then in terms of your anxiety around the opportunists. And I guess throughout the last 6 to 7 weeks, I'd be interested to know the times when you were a bit wobbly, right? Because I know you're a big picture thinker, and for 95% of the time, even 98% of the time, you were fine. But what was the 2% of the things that were sort of keeping you up? You mentioned there one was the opportunist. Was there anything else? Because Ben and I have been positive and optimistic throughout this process, because we've tried to sort the noise, the facts from the noise. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that there was 24, 48 hours where I did sort of have to really go through my thinking and get through the other side to be able to be in a position where we could provide some leadership throughout this. So did you go through that, or were you rock solid, mate? You just you weren't wobbly at all?
Look, from a business point of view, the end of March was the low point in sentiment. So that was where people were feeling the worst, because this is when all the changes were happening, like lockdown. There was a news article out there saying 150,000 people would die in Australia from COVID-19, stuff like that. So you could imagine the anxiety with clients. Investment in general was quite low. The very following Monday, I remember that it was a Friday in March, and the next Monday they announced JobKeeper. That kind of underpinned a lot of the, the businesses from just letting off staff, because I think a lot of businesses were almost looking at just to cut it was almost like, because other businesses were doing it, let's cut costs. So I was just worried about how far that would go, because you don't want unemployment growing into all levels of the economy. And unfortunately, it's been focused a lot on, a lot of part-time workers in hospitality, like the arts. I mentioned that accounts for 60% of the current losses. That, you don't want to see more of that, because that puts a lot of pressure on all levels of the economy, because, the government's got to support these people. The rents are going to, your tenants with residential are going to be struggling to pay. There were lobby groups saying, don't pay your rent. There was a few opportunist tenants coming up in commercials, just holding out, waiting for the government's decision to decide if they were going to pay rent or not. And then luckily all the COVID cases started coming down in Australia, and confidence has just been slowly creeping up quite well. And last week we were, from a new inquiry point of view, at our business Rethink Investing, we're at sort of 80% what we were in February. So we're not at the original levels, but I think people are now coming back into the market, and the confidence is, I guess, the biggest thing with all of this. When people are not confident, they don't just hoard toilet paper and pantry supplies. They also hoard their cash. They don't spend it, and that's not good for the economy. And that's one of the reasons the share market crashed. But April was the best share price growth they've had since in 20 plus years. So April, whether it was a dead cat bounce or not, it's recovered, and that just shows people are, I guess, liking the direction we're going as Australia's kind of controlled the virus very well. And I think that's the biggest thing, the confidence. And look, we're all going to kind of feel the same thing to a degree. I always see things from an opportunity point of view. I thought, this is going to be a great buying opportunity. And, to this moment, one thing I've actually been a little bit disappointed from a buying point of view is stock has dried up. So people are just not bringing properties to the market. And that, to sort of go back to the early part of our conversation, why property prices won't just crash 20%, 30% overall, it's because it's harder to bring your property to the market. People are more reluctant to sell, not just because the interest rates are lower, just because they don't think they're going to get their best possible price. So they're going to hold their asset off the market, and that's just going to contribute to lower stock levels. And there will be a pent-up demand once this is all released as well. And I think that's something that I thought there'd be more discounts available by now, to be honest. But the market's holding firm in good quality parts. We don't, both our businesses would never consider buying in those areas where, the risk is higher, because it is junk stock to a degree, and there's not going to be that same growth, or it's just a long-term, not a good quality asset to hold. But, to answer your question again, look, it's just interesting times, like the lack of stock and, just the buyer activity slowly increasing is kind of got the confidence slowly creeping back. And, the buyers are all still there that can buy. They're just looking for a good deal. And, it's definitely a different mood to what it was compared to late March, that's for sure.
Scott, we're obviously of similar belief. Right? These types of times are where the reality is that those who see opportunity transfer greater wealth into their pockets. That has been proven throughout the decades and the years that those who are more optimistic tend to be wealthier. That's an observation that I'm sure you could have with anyone who's been studying a behaviour in investment and risk over the many years. You can still be over optimistic, and you can cook the books in terms of getting too greedy, but One thing that is true in terms of the observations that we've all made for people who've been doing this for, a couple of decades now and have also watched others come before them, is that those people who act on their optimistic outlooks, because fundamentally the world is made up of more optimists than pessimists, and that's how we grow, and that's how we change, and that's how we improve quality of life and do all the things that we do. If there was more pessimists, there'd be less science, there'd be less activity in terms of creative arts and less things happening. So it's that I draw the most strength on. That the sad reality is for those 20% of people who are forever pessimists and are looking for their one moment in the sun where they might be right over a 40 or a 50-year period. It's really sad for them, because ultimately, they've been hoping and praying for something that just may not come. Whereas the optimists tend to get on with it, and I think you're a good example of that in terms of that type of right mindset. And you're mentioning before that your inquiry's picking up. We can validate that in our own business. Some of the stock that we're on, we've got a challenge with stock at the moment too, and the good stock has still got bloody 4 or 5 buyers on it, right?
Yeah.
So we're missing out, aren't we, Bryce?
Absolutely.
If you want to share some experiences that we've had recently.
Well, it's an important point, because you and you'd agree with it, Scott, with what you've just sort of picked up, that you said, oh, geez, I thought there'd be more opportunity, more discounting. I mean, look, to be honest, we're buying stuff within our own team where, sure, there is 5 and in some case 10% value drops from prior. But I only see that as very temporary, right? And it's just really a mindset thing rather than the fundamentals of the market thing. But I guess ultimately we've been through some of these things before. We've been through GFC. We've now been through this pandemic. What was interesting was just to see the difference between having an economic event that matched with a health event as well, which wasn't really had much precedent before. But it's good to see that. People that were level-headed, remained calm, were able to pick up some in our experience, some properties that were A-grade properties at a very small window of reduced competition. But now I can say, in talking to the team this week, that reduced competition is no longer the case on anything that we're interested in. The competition is very strong.
One thing I've always done personally, because when I first bought my first property in Sydney, 2010, there was many articles stating 40% crashes were coming. And then I saw these articles almost every second year. There was a lot going around in 2018. I actually say, and I encourage everyone to do this, when you see these stories, just do a screenshot and save it. So you got the date, and there, you can basically revisit these articles, to yourself 12 months later. And you just see every time how wrong they are. Like there was one that I saw in 2018. It was in all the major newspapers, 40 to 50% crash. And guess what? The property market actually grew about 8% after that article. So they were 58% wrong. And yet a lot of people were going to make decisions based on that, that spook type article that comes out. And when you just see this, you take everything in context. So you don't just say, yeah, it's never going to happen. But, it's just good to, I guess, that's a way of controlling your own emotions where you see these things. And just, it's easy for me and you guys to say, yeah, this is not going to happen because we've lived through this stuff and we've invested. We see the on the ground results. But for someone who's never invested, just they're going to get influenced by that article they see on a Friday night that's telling them the world's going to end. And, if you can sort of show them that this is just how the media works, this is all part of it, but we're buying for the right fundamentals. Long term, this property is going to be in demand because it's got a train station there. It's there's a increased population. The zoning's getting more favourable. There's more income coming into this area. Like these things are more important than just trying to catch a falling knife in a market that might drop 10% in the hope that you're going to get it at that exact low point. It's a fool's quest.
Yeah, as we always say, a throwaway line that the economists and all these international commentators have predicted 27 of the last 2 recessions. So quite often there's overemphasis on that.
Can we finish off with rounding out, lifting your eyes around industrial and retail. So we did the office one first, but I'm curious in terms of your views of where you see in industrial and also retail in the course of the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. So look, I think the greatest opportunities out there that I'm seeing at the moment, just due to pretty much like a very sharp increase in demand, is industrial. Industrial, almost by the day, you can see it's improving in some areas because a lot of businesses
they got to store
online.
The goods that people are buying online.
Yeah. Well, I heard on the radio the other day that the toll roads in Sydney car movements were down. I think they said 85%, but truck movements were up 30% in that time. So people are at home ordering stuff online. You need to store stuff. You need to collect it from ports, store it in warehouses. Australia Post is, increasing its floor space because it just can't keep up with demand. Also, there's I guess more businesses need to sort of go for that next day delivery stuff and hold more stock because maybe their overseas supply chains are slower. You can't rely on buying a whole heap of stuff from China consistently. So maybe you need to then focus more on local manufacturing or store more of these stuff at one point in time. So industrial space, I think, is just going to be a really good growth market long term. Because even in 50 years' time, I can't see there's going to be less of a need for space. As long as there's more people in Australia and you're buying, a built-out area, I can't imagine they're going to start building upwards in industrial because that would cost too much. There's going to be some areas where they probably will do that, but industrial floor space will be valuable. I think retail, I've been asking a lot of people about what do they think about ordering online with Coles and Woolies and stuff like that. Because one of the things I'm just trying to make my own opinion of is, are supermarkets going to be less in demand? And I know every time I order stuff online with Coles, you get all the old fruit. You can't pick your stuff. You can't, even ordering online, it is I don't know. It's a very sterile experience. And yeah, I don't like shopping. But it's
not the best of
when
days.
it comes to when it comes to sort of picking your food and that, I just can't imagine even like the floor space of somewhere like a Coles or Woolies or IGA is just going to go anywhere because people want to go and forage for their own food. It's human nature. That's not going to go anywhere, I don't think. It's also a bit of a stock, a storage area for them anyway because it's a large floor space. It's good for their brand. If they start all going online, you're going to have a lot more competitors pop up that you've never heard of. So I think brand awareness and footprint will forever be important. Some retail shops are, look at Apple, for instance. They have flagship stores that add to their brand. So I don't think retail will suffer. I think there might be an adjustment in some high price rents because there's some parts where the rent just has grown too far over the last 30 years, but maybe a 3% increase in, let's use the Parramatta example. You've got some owners that are generally fairly wealthy and they've been hitting up their tenant for a 3% increase for the last 30 years to the point where it's now too expensive for that business to grow because they haven't been growing at 3% per annum for the last 30 years. So there's a bit of a discrepancy between fair rent and actual rent. So I guess this will just all even out over time. That's what the economy will do. And my job is to find where the rent is fair. Where it's actually cheap, where the tenant has a good revenue versus their fixed rental costs. So if the rent goes up, they can easily absorb that. Some of the higher price markets, it's got to breaking point. So I guess that's where the knowledge comes into it. You avoid those unaffordable markets and you buy where it still makes sense from a business point of view. It makes sense for the tenant to want to pay that rent. And that's what we've got to work out. And that's where there's great opportunity for future growth and consistent income and easy reletting on that property as well, if that tenant left.
Hey, Scott, I know that you keep an eye on across the country. Is there any particular conditions across any particular border that is favourable at the moment that where you see opportunity?
So I like Southeast Queensland because it's got a really good mix of high yields, affordable rents for the tenants, and it's also affordable for investors. So your dollar goes quite far versus Sydney or Melbourne. I like Canberra as well because it's got the government stable, kind of theme to it. There's a high average income down there. It's a planned community, so oversupply is less likely to happen in many formats down there.
How do you go with land tax in that market, Scott? Just quickly, how
the tenant will pay it. The tenant pays 100% of the outgoing, so it's factored in for the rent. So as a landlord, we will only ever have it if the tenant goes vacant. And again, that's part of the research. We'll check if that's a 30-year-old building, how many years of that 30 years has that been vacant, and it might be a vacant for 18 months over that 30 years. So it's good to understand this type of stuff. There's also no stamp duty payable for properties under 1.5 million for commercial property there. So, that's a pretty significant upfront saving. So it might mean if you've got a budget of 900 grand, you can all of a sudden now go to $1 million because you don't have that land tax liability. That goes for ACT as well. So there's no land tax for commercial. Sorry, South Australia. South Australia's got no commercial land stamp duty. So these are sort of, I guess, means you can get in for less money, so your entry level costs are lower. South Australia's got, it's been often referred to as a bit of a boring property market because it never grows quickly, never contracts quickly. It's kind of a bit of a stable market, but with commercial, because you've got that underlying high cash flow, 6, 7, 8% net return, a boring market's a good market because you're making such significant amount of money just through cash flow. If it grows 3 or 4% on top, it's more than a bonus. It's a very good margin on your investment.
For sure.
Hey Scott, is obviously Australia is your pond. Is New Zealand something that you keep an eye on?
Look, not so much, but I've heard they've recently sort of relaxed the 40% deposit ratios. I haven't done much research into it. My opinion with Australia is what we're finding on our shores, the numbers work so well. Like an interest rate of 3% for a commercial loan for a decent lender. Like I'm personally on 2.59% for my commercial loans, which if I'm going to buy an 8% net return investment in a capital city, or even if 6% net return in a capital city, the margins even on just the debt are so good. So I'll be the first to probably look abroad, when I guess the opportunities here aren't worthwhile. But I don't know. I just find it still works at the moment. Commercial is just been. It's been quite lucrative in terms of I guess your dollar seems to go further in that space. There's less attention. It's a harder market to operate in because it is very niche. There's not much stock out there. If you have 100 clients that want 100 properties, that's going to take a long time to filter through because you're not going to find 100 good properties with a good tenant just waiting for you. Like it's very different, and that's why it's I guess not a real kind of scalable thing. You really got to pick the markets. You've got to know the locals, and you've got to get access to stuff off market, which is what we really try to position ourselves to do. But you can't really cover huge amounts of areas just because there's just not enough out there. It's a very kind of niche space. And yes, you'll go online to realcommercial.com and find a lot of stock, but 95% of it you wouldn't buy because it's maybe an off the plan industrial complex in Whoop Whoop, or maybe it's in a little regional town and the town's getting bypassed and everyone knows let's sell because that highway is going to deviate everyone away from that commercial space. So you've got to be careful of those kind of big risk moments. But the good quality stuff, once you buy it and hold it, you tend to just never want to sell it.
So give us your crystal ball then, Scott. How do you see? Clearly, it's a prediction that is just your best guess. But how do you see Australia playing out from your perspective between now and Christmas?
Which part of the market?
Just in terms of how people will get back to work, how you see the economy recovering, what impact that you see that having on resi, but also I think you've covered your views on commercial.
Yeah, so I think residential, I think it's going to be not you're hearing a lot of the sort of banks put out reports, and they're always their worst case scenario results. So I think as I said, I always look back at history, what the media was saying and what predictors are saying, and you tend to find the there's more of a watered down version of the reality. So I think residential wise, your highest priced markets with the lowest yields and the most supply, most exposed to like overseas migration, will be the ones that suffer the most. So I think, parts of Sydney where there's and Melbourne where there's, I guess, the high rise markets, you're going to see price falls there. I actually don't think they're the types of properties I'd want to buy in even after they've fallen, because there might be a slow recovery period for those. The tighter held markets, like your freestanding housing markets in like your middle and out, like inner and middle ring suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, are just going to hold pretty steady. There might be slight falls, like you said. You've seen some 5 to 10% discounts, but I feel like we're already past that worst case part of the where people's emotions were. So we're actually, Australians feel better. Like, I know when you walk around the streets now, you're not instantly thinking, I'm going to get sick. There's actually that feeling that it is safer out there, and there might be a second wave with this. But I can see that the government and every business is implementing some COVID safety measures, and it's all about keeping distances. You got your duct tape on the floor of shops to say don't stand this closer than this. I think there's going to be just a slow movement back into normal life. You can see the government's pushing it, because the quicker that happens, the less net debt the government's going to acquire. But Australia's gained international recognition with how well we've handled this. So we're still viewed as a stable, strong economy outside of Australia. And I've even got one of my clients. He's an Italian doctor, and he almost laughs at us. Go, look how strict you guys are. You got no problems. Why the hell are you still all closed up? And that's their opinion, because they've gone through such hell over there. And just the fact that they view us almost being over, too strict with it is interesting, because relative to their lifestyle, they've gone through hell and back. And I think the Australian economy will be better than what people think, but it's going to be a slow recovery. And there's just going to be parts of the economy that are more risky than others. But the demand and want for people to rebuild will come back very strong, especially being cooped up in your house for a while. The first people are, that you want to get back into it. You want to support your local businesses. You want to travel locally. You want to put your money back into this economy. And I think, there'll be a lot of benefits from that. And then the infrastructure spending will start. So these things will, make it not as bad as everyone thinks it would be. So I'm optimistic, but the IMF saying Australia is going to grow by its GDP by 6.1% in 2021 next year. So this year, not the best year. We're going to be down, but next year it's looking pretty good for most sectors, even if COVID lingers around.
Nice summary, Scott. I think you're right. I think Australia and Australians take the comfort in the fact that we can flatten the curve. So we will have increased cases as we open up a little bit. We also say to everyone, download the COVID Safe app. It's going to be very helpful for us. So we can control how the outbreak is going to take shape. I do feel for those vulnerable people and those people who do have pre-existing medical conditions are probably going to have to be kept inside, and that's unfortunate for them and secluded. So that's challenging for them until we get better medical and potentially the vaccine. So, not every Australian is going to enjoy that, but I do think we are an optimistic country on the whole. The quiet Australians are mostly the optimistic ones, and I can understand people who are in a position where they may have lost their job and they're knee deep in all of the negativity, and that's impacting their mindset and their biases at the moment. But I think, as we say, we can confidently understand that our caseloads are going to increase, but we're ready for it. The hospitals are ready for it. We are learning more about treatment and getting better successful treatment. So in terms of fatality rates, I suspect will be as low as they are here already in Australia, because we've done very, very good on that respect. So I do think we are starting to have more comfort around that, but there will be some negative news that is going to be coming over the next couple of months. Shocking data in terms of economic data, but we're letting everyone know that we expect that, right? That's happening right now, that the economy's shut. And so the numbers that we see coming through in as late as August and September are for reports for June and events that occurred, and that's that lag data that we've got to get past. But I think in general terms, the GDP numbers for the September quarter will be an improvement, and they will look like a V-shaped recovery in the earlier stages, because it's only natural that if you open things up and people spend, you're going to get a bounce off the bottom. So that will be straight away. And then hopefully we can maintain that, and we'll be doing more around, being optimistic and rather than pessimistic, and hopeful, get behind Buy Australia and some regional tourism and some travel and get, those places opened up after the fires, after the drought, take a holiday, do what you can to support the economy. And all of a sudden, we can build on that momentum that we really did have back in February, that the data was showing us. I mean, unemployment rate sort of reduced in March and everyone thought it would be catastrophic, right? So I think there is something there. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your views around the market. We'll obviously have your details in the show notes where people can potentially check out more of your content and learn more about what it takes to be an investor in the commercial space. So, mate, thank you again for coming on to the show today. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
And good luck with your 6-month-old there, mate, as you navigate that for the first time, which is great.
Cheers, mate.
Okay, Ben, thanks for coming back onto the property couch.
So there you go, Bryce. I mean, yeah, it was. I think we needed to spend a bit of time on commercial property. We property podcast first. So I think from that point of view, it just gave a good insight, measured responses. Definitely some challenges there, some more barriers of entry, but really good about being particular about your due diligence and doing your research. So you're not just exactly the same as resi property. You're not just buying any asset or throwing a dart at the dartboard and hoping that you're going to get the same result. So thanks, Scott, for coming on and sharing those insights and the expertise there. And I think, again, it also highlights the people that you socialise with and hang around, and the mindsets that they have can also be very influential to you in terms of taking that positive attitude and turning that optimism into opportunity. And so Scotty's obviously doing that very, very well, as is all of the people who work with him in terms of, changing those people's lives, getting into commercial property.
He's a good guy, Scott. I've enjoyed a couple of the interviews that we've had with him, Ben. I've spoken to him a number of times in between those as well. Just a good, humble human being who's had success and knows what he's talking about. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is it's interesting, right? Because we're in isolation. I don't know if you have noticed, Ben, but Lego has made prime time. Have you noticed that?
I believe it is on television.
It is on television. It's called Lego Masters. Hamish Blake is the host. Now, I've got to be honest, Ben, I thought, really? Prime time? Lego? How is that possible? Have you ever seen it?
No, but I believe it's rating very well.
It is outstanding. It is so good. So my life hack today is if you've got kids and you want to find an exercise to bond with them, and given that in ISO you're spending more time in front of the telly than you would otherwise, let's be honest, right? Even those who are strictest diets around electronics are finding that they're doing more. My life hack to you is if you want to bond with your kids and you want to actually see some really good, creative folks who can do some amazing stuff with Lego, and I'm not associated with Channel 9, Ben, so I've got there's no industry
commercial.
There's no industry mates that I'm actually trying to puff up here, but mate, it's awesome. In fact, a couple of times me and Andrew have looked at each other and said, the kids are asleep, should we actually just go one episode ahead and let them catch up without us? So there you have it.
I love the fact that it's on demand, so it's 9 now.
9 now. Yeah, I don't watch telly live, Ben. It drives me nuts, but I do it when I want to watch it. But
I'll commit to you, mate, that I will be watching that with the kids over the course of the weekend. So because I thought it would be a great motivator for them to get the Lego sets out, because we have Lego.
It is.
We have so much Lego.
I hear you. I know what you're about to say. It's going to drive you nuts that they never play with it. You buy it and then it just sits in a bag. Mate, the kids are inspired.
Okay, good.
And they think Hamish is the greatest host that has ever lived. So I just put
because he's a big kid. He's a ripper.
Well, every now and then I put a location and escape up there just to remind these other hosts that they know. But I'm nowhere near in comparison to Hamish. So there you go, folks. Lego Masters. Go back to season 1, Ben. Do season 1 first, and then go through to the current series of season 2. So that's my life hack for the parents out there, or in fact for anyone who just actually likes to see some creative folk do some cool things. Ben, did you know?
Oh, Bryce, I've got a couple for you. Obviously, we'll finish off with our time as tenants, because I think that's a fascinating story. But the first one I want to talk about is the JobKeeper package. And I want to correlate that to the story of unemployment, right? So firstly, how do you qualify? You need less than a reduction of 30% or more in income, right? Now, you need to register on the ATO website. Now, the ATO website has had 728,000 registrations from businesses, right? So that's a solid number. Now, what happens is the criteria is how do you measure that negative 30 or more is to last year's year-on-year result, which is month to month. So has there been, from the previous April month to the current April month, has there been a 30% decline, or also quarter to quarter? So, and if you don't qualify for some months, you can still, for April that is, you can still potentially qualify for future months. Now, the shut-off price is actually tomorrow, May the 8th, for the April thing. But here's the deal, right?
What's the deal?
I've been listening to a couple of commentators talking about the extrapolation of the 728,000 businesses who have registered. And that is accommodating what they believe is 4.7 million employees. Amazing, right? A very good subsidy idea, wage subsidy idea, recognised globally as the best of breed. Credit to the Labor Party for also sticking to their guns in saying that this would be the best stimulus. So tick to the Labor Party there. But the Treasury were forecasting 6 million unemployed people would get this benefit. So that is a material saving to government if it doesn't materialise like that. And that's 1.3 million people who potentially the Treasury would forecast to be unemployed that may not be unemployed, Bryce, or not just yet. Okay, so remembering that this has still got some time to play out, and so there will still be people who do lose employment if the virus continues on like it is. So, again, we want to be very careful and sensitive to those people who are doing it tough right now. But that to me says, because if you extrapolate that out, you're thinking unemployment could get to 12%, and it just might, because again, we're not out of the woods yet. But I'm curious in terms of that 728,000, we registered a couple of our businesses in the, when we're doing some random, well, not random forecasting. Safety net forecasting, because we needed to make sure our cash flows were going to get us through so we could keep all of our staff employed, which we've been able to do to date. And so, but two of our businesses that we thought would experience a downturn didn't. Correct. So I'm hoping that there's literally tens of thousands of businesses like that out there where they didn't experience that as well, which is a good sign. It means that those businesses haven't experienced more than a 30% decline, because if you look at all the economic data, it's pretty ugly. So I just wanted to shout that out. So time will tell. Hopefully we're in a little bit better position than the pessimists and the people who are saying the doomsdayers who think that this is going to be worse than it actually is. So we'll keep an eye on that one. Finally, Bryce.
Ben, can I set this up for you?
Yeah, sure.
You'd be an elitist yourself, wouldn't you? One of those greedy property investors. I mean, you would not be able to understand how a tenant thinks, surely.
Well, Bryce, I drive a 2011 Volkswagen Golf. Not sure that puts me in an elitist category. We have two second-hand cars. Not sure that puts me in an elitist category.
But you couldn't relate to a tenant, surely.
Well, let me just share with you, Bryce, my number, because I thought I'll do this because I spent 10 years living in Sydney. I also had an amazing time living and working up in the Whitsundays at Hamilton Island for a period of time there, which was also great. So I did the math. I did the math earlier today thinking, I think I can relate to what tenants are going through, Bryce, because I've had 13 in my lifetime. What? Outside of growing up in one little house in Fundura as I call it, in a court. We never moved, but I moved out of home in my late teens to go a bit closer to town to, have a bit of freedom. I then bought my first property at the age of 23 in Fundura again, across the road from mum and dad in the same court. And since then, Bryce, I have lived in 13 different rental properties and 4 owner-occupied properties.
So you can relate, Ben.
I think I can relate. I think I've spent plenty of time. And even recently, Bryce, when we were renovating the house, we had to move out.
Yeah.
So I've had, in the last 5 years, I've lived in 2 different rental properties for periods of 6 months or more during those renovation periods. So I'm not saying that I don't appreciate that some tenants do it harder than others. I totally get that. But in terms of, I've paid rent, I've had things go faulty, I've had things not work, I've rung the property manager. I am a property owner, as you know, I've got multiple properties. I know how all that works. So, but to think that we just wouldn't appreciate what it's like. But what about you, Bryce? How many properties
Well,
have
it's funny you
rented?
say that, because then I'm thinking, well, what's it for me, right? But because I went from, Ben, I moved out of home, and then I went from Perth to Brisbane,
Yes.
Brisbane to the Gold Coast, Gold Coast to Melbourne, Melbourne to Brisbane, Brisbane to London, London to Gold Coast to Melbourne. I mean, that's just, and then, so I've actually, which doesn't include the rental in London. And it doesn't include the rental that location gave me when I first started filming up in Sydney, whilst I still had my family down here in Melbourne.
Okay.
14, Ben.
14 tenancies. There you go.
And even for those folks who, I've just recently moved to Torquay, Ben, to move into the school zone that I wanted to be in. I was in a rental before I moved into the house that we purchased that I live in now. So, Ben, 14.
There we go.
So I certainly... I have been a rent investor for a large part of my property investing career. I've purchased in WA, I've purchased in New South Wales, I've purchased in Victoria, I've purchased in Queensland, Ben, but I have been a rent investor for a lot of that.
Very good. So there you go. There's a little bit of Did You Know About the Ben and Bryce Show. So, all right.
So, Ben, I did not know that about you until we quickly did the maths before we went there, and I knew what you're up to. So, but that is very insightful that we both can actually empathise with what it takes to be a tenant and what they are going through and what it's like when a tenant...
moving house, my God, moving house. What a mess that is. What a mess that is.
I'd be happy if I never moved ever again. Ever again. Seriously, particularly across borders. All right, so there you go, folks. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you got some wonderful insights there from Scott, who we super appreciate taking his time out to come and share with our audience. But until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks. Oh, and don't forget to check out the Facebook Live this afternoon. See you, folks.
Hey there, folks. Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listen to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now, for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarizes the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.